The honourable member for Barrie Innisfil.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The eyes of the nation are upon us tonight. Earlier today, the Prime Minister signalled, as did a member of his backbench, that tonight's vote is a confidence vote. Convention requires that the Prime Minister to publicly declare a confidence vote of this nature as such following convention. My question for the government House Leader is the vote tonight a confidence vote? And if the vote is lost, will the Prime Minister plunge us into an election?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the debate, but it's time to vote.
Hear, hear.
The question is the following one. Mr. Medicino, seconded by Mr. Trudeau, moved that pursuant to Section 58 of the Emergencies Act, this House confirm the declaration of a public order emergency proclaimed on February 14th, 2022. La période de 10 minutes pour les députés votants.
The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favour of the motion will please rise.
Gabra.
Mr. Algabra.
Ms. Grove.
Ms. Grove.
Mr. McGuinty.
Mr. McGuinty.
Mr. Scarpellegia.
Ms. Scarpellegia.
Ms. Cara.
Ms. Cara.
Monsieur Vandal.
Mr. Vandal.
Monsieur McKinnon-Gatineau.
Mr. McKinnon-Gatineau.
Monsieur Miller.
Mr. Miller.
Mr. Mendicino.
Mr. Mendicino.
Monsieur Serré.
Mr. Serré.
Mr. Dhaliwal.
Mr. Dhaliwal.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Mr. Arsenault.
Monsieur Sanson.
Mr. Sanson.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mrs. Romanado.
Mrs. Romanado.
Mr. Lamour.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Ms. Sahota.
Ms. Sahota.
Mr. Virani.
Mr. Virani.
Mr. Fergus.
Mr. Fergus.
Mr. Ananda Sangari.
Mr. Ananda Sangari.
Ms. Dillon.
Ms. Dillon.
Mr. Essassi.
Mr. Assassi.
Madame Mendez.
Madame Mendez.
Mr. Nagvi.
Mr. Nakvi.
Mr. Sidhu Brampton East.
Mr. Sidhu Brampton East.
Mrs. Suds.
Mrs. Suds.
Mr. Fragiscaros.
Mr. Fragiscatos.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Shifke.
Mr. Shifke.
Mr. Sorbara.
Mr. Sorbara.
Mr. Dong.
Mr. Dong.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Ms. Blaney.
Ms. Blaney.
Monsieur Boulris.
Mr. Boulris.
Madame Hughes.
Madam Hughes.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. Idlov.
Ms. Idlov.
Ms. Barron.
Ms. Barron.
Ms. Maye-Saanich, Gulf Islands.
Ms. Maye-Saanich, Gulf Islands.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Ms. Bergen.
Ms. Bergen.
Ms. Finlay.
Ms. Finlay.
Monsieur Paulus.
Mr. Paulus.
Mr. Nater.
Mr. Nater.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Aldous.
Ms. Danshaw.
Ms. Danshaw.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Duncan Stormont Dundas Salgangari.
Mr. Duncan Stormont Dundas Southern Gary.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Calkins.
Mr. Calkins.
Mr. Upal.
Mr. Upal.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Aitchison.
Mr. Aitchison.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Gourde.
Mr. Gould.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Steinley.
Ms. Rude.
Ms. Rude.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Ms. Lewis Alderman Norfolk.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Aboultaif.
Mr. Aboutayev.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Deltel.
Monsieur Deltel.
Monsieur Godin.
Monsieur Godin.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Wall.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Motz.
Mr. Motz.
Monsieur Lew.
Mr. Lew.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Doddle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Kurek.
Mr. Kurek.
Mr. Morrison,
Mr. Morrison,
Mr. Patzer,
Patzer,
Mr. Soroka,
Mr. Soroka,
Mr. Van Pupta,
Mr. Van Pupta,
Mr. Ruff,
Mr. Ruff,
Mr. Brock,
Mr. Brock,
Mr. Muse,
Mr. Muse,
Mrs. Roberts,
Mrs. Roberts,
Mr. Barrett,
Mr. Barrett,
Mr. Poiliev,
Mr. Polyev,
Monsieur Terrien,
Mr. Terrier,
Monsieur Sainte-Marie, Madame Normandin, Monsieur Simard,
Mr. Simard,
Monsieur Bergeron,
Mr. Bergeron,
Madame de Bellefeuille,
Madame de Bellefeuille,
Madame Michaud,
Madame Michaud,
Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe,
Monsieur Brunel Duceppe,
Monsieur Thériault,
Monsieur Thériault,
Monsieur Perron,
Monsieur Perron,
Monsieur Barsalou-Duval,
Monsieur Barcelou Duval,
Monsieur Champoux,
Monsieur Champoux,
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings. I wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended. I will invite members who encounter technical difficulties to identify themselves. If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them. Ms. Zurowitz.
Mr. Speaker, my app has asked me to confirm that I have voted, and I vote yay.
Your vote has been cast as yes. Madame Kayabaga.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je voudrais voter oui pour la motion.
Merci.
Okay, bon. Mr. Morris.
Mr. Speaker, I had issues with the app. I will be voting nay contre.
Mr. Morris, nay contre.
Okay. Madame Wagenthal.
Yes, thank you, Speaker. I would like to confirm that I voted nay.
Against contre.
Mr. Hoback.
Mr. Speaker, to confirm that I voted no.
Mr. Fall.
Yeah, he confirmed.
Mr. Fall.
My vote was recorded as a nay.
Okay, I voted good. Mr. Fast.
Mr. Speaker, I vote no.
Mr. Fast, against contre.
Mr. McLean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to make sure you know that I vote no to this motion.
Mr. McLean, against contre.
Monsieur Singh.
I vote for the motion. Shame.
Mr. Singh, pour.
Ms. Thomas.
Mr. Speaker, I want to confirm that my vote is no.
Mrs. Thomas, against contre.
Ms. Goodridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to confirm that my vote is no.
Confirmed?
It is confirmed. Mr. Genius.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to confirm that my vote was cast as a nay.
It is registered. It is registered. Mr. Redekop.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just too want to confirm that my vote was cast as a negative nay.
Your vote was registered as nay. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart. Okay, maybe we'll go back. Ms. Kwan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My voting app was not working, and I vote yes.
Ms. Kwan, pour 4.
Ms. Gray.
Mr. Speaker, I vote no.
That is confirmed.
That is confirmed. Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to confirm that my vote was a nay.
Your vote was registered as nay. Mr. Viss.
Mr. Speaker, I confirm that my vote was nay.
It is confirmed at nay. Mr. Stewart.
Can you hear me?
Go for it.
Can you hear me now?
In any way. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, we will compile a vote.
Yeas pour 185, 185. Nays contre 151, 151.
I declare the motion carried. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on a point of order.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to file with you pursuant to Section 59 of the Emergencies Act a motion to revoke the Prime Minister's emergency declaration that was proclaimed last week. More than 20 members of the Conservative Party.
The Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, as you are aware, there was a House order. The House would adjourn after the vote, Mr. Speaker.
We were waiting for 2 points of order this time. I'll let her finish, and then we'll finish up
Consider
the
the matter at the next sit-in week. I say this to all Canadians, that Conservatives will continue to use every tool at our disposal to end the Prime Minister's abuse.
The Honourable Speaker,
point of order, Mr. Speaker.
You can't even.
This is not a point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Are we done? The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I would just like to take the time to thank the staff who stayed over the course of the weekend, the clerks, the House administrators.